Hi there, and welcome to episode 5 of Gertie and me, my tales of living with a sock knitting machine. So in this episode I'm going to show you how I do a heel on my sock machine. There are various methods of how to do a heel and how to do it successfully. This method is just one. So like in any hand knitting or crochet or anything like that, please do find a method that suits you and the way that you work. This is the method that suits me, and it's the method that I find quickest and gives the best fitting heel for my feet. It takes maybe 10 minutes to do the whole heel, and then I repeat the entire process to do the toe as well. So once you learn one method to do the heel, you can then use it again to do your toes. Okay, so here we go. Okay, so you're gonna have to forgive me some background noise. I hope it's not too noisy. So we're going to start our heel. So I've knit a 90 row leg, which includes the length of my cuff. And to do the heel, what you need to do is take your crescent tool that you got with your machine, or something similar to enable you to lift up your needles. So what I need to do is lift up the back half of my needles. So the front of my machine is here where the yarn carrier is, and then this is the back. So you need to lift the back half of your needles. If you have a new machine, this might be marked for you, but if it's not, you should have a marked forward position on your machine, which is right at the front. All you have to do is count forward half of the front half of your stitches, so a quarter of the stitches one way and a quarter of the way the other, and just make a marking on either side of your cylinder, just so that you know where your halves of your stitches are. So I'm going to raise the back half of my needles on my 64 cylinder. Okay, so you can see now, if I just pop my hand back there, that half of my needles are raised at the back. This means that these needles will not work from this point on. The only needles that will work and will be in action are the front needles that are in the down position, like this. So what you first need to do, once you've raised your needles, you actually need to put on the brake on your machine. So this is the top of my machine here, and this thing here is the brake. You can see that it's weighted just here. So we take the working yarn and lift it onto the brake, and as you can see, it just lifts the yarn just here. And this part here, where you put your yarn over this little brake arm here, actually stops the yarn from moving. It's a really important part of doing the heel or the toe on a machine, is to make sure that your brake is engaged. So what we'll do at this point is just crank forward, and you'll hear it click, and then as soon as the yarn carrier of the machine gets to these needles, it will stop clicking, so you'll know that you've knitted all of your in-use needles. Okay, so you can see here, this is where the sock has stopped being knitted, or I should say the heel. And what we now need to do is, because the yarn is riding up on these stitches, we need to hang some extra weights. You may have received some weights with your machine. I received a small heel weight, but I actually wanted to get some larger ones. So I found a seller on Etsy that sold weights for the machine, and it is actually just a dinner fork with the ends turned over with a weight attached to the bottom. So this weight acts as a heel weight, and it allows you to add tension to your machine when you're knitting the heel wherever you want. So what I do is I attach one, I have 3 of these, I attach one in the centre, right in the centre of that heel. I attach a second to the right, about an inch down from the actual needles themselves, and then you'll be able to see this one quite clearly. And I'll add another one just here. So you can see it's about an inch down, and you can see that there's extra tension being added to these stitches just here because they're pulling out a little bit more. What these weights allow you to do is actually hang extra weight on these back stitches that are being knitted, because you're creating extra fabric on this part of the sock. So now the weights are hung, we're going to crank backwards and back along these needles in the opposite direction. What we need to do first is, because we've cranked this way, we actually need to lift. If I can just focus on this 1 second. So this is the first needle of our heel. So now we've cranked forward and we've gone past the first half of our stitches. We need to lift this first needle so that it's no longer being used. So you're creating short rows by disengaging the use of needles as you go around. So that one's pulled up, and now we crank backwards. Nice and slowly. And when it stops clicking again, you know that you've knitted all of these needles. So now what we're going to do, so I just pop my hand there, you might be able to see, is lift this next needle up, and we're going to crank forwards again. And I'm just going to repeat that. So every time you go around and the needles stop clicking, you lift the next needle and then back. Okay, so I'm just going to keep going back and forth. You're doing exactly the same thing each time. Okay, so on the back just here, if I zoom in just so that you can see what's going on. So you can see at this back needle just here, the yarn's starting to ride up the needle. That means that there's not enough tension being placed on the extra fabric that's being knitted into the heel. So what we need to do is adjust our weight. So you can see, because I've knitted a few rows, the weights have dropped down. So what I'm going to do is just adjust that weight upwards, and that will allow me to knit a few extra rows. So that weight goes upwards, and so do the rest, in exactly the same way. And what you want to do is, when you hang or rehang your weights to ensure that you've got the correct amount of tension, just keep moving these inwards so that they're actually below needles that are actually being knitted at that time. So now I've done that, I can again lift this needle and I can start going backwards and forwards again. So you're constantly watching your yarn, so it's starting to ride up a little bit again. So I'm just going to move these weights inwards a little bit, and the same on the opposite side, and again move that centre weight up a little too. If I just move this around, you might be able to see how my weights are hung. So ignoring these needles that are in the way, so you can see that my weights are hung quite nicely. So there's one set here, one set here, and one set just here. So I'm going to carry on going back and forth on my heel stitches until I've got a smaller amount, so that the tip of your heel in the middle. What I tend to do is carry on going back and forth until I have 8 stitches remaining between those unengaged needles that you're lifting up. Okay, so I've finished going back and forth on my first part of my heel, and you can see that I've got 8 stitches remaining that are actually active at the moment. So what we need to do now is, if you've ever knitted a short row heel before, you know that you decrease down to a certain point and then you start decreasing and re-knitting those stitches. Again, that's exactly the same principle that I use when I make my heel on the sock knitting machine. So at the moment, the yarn is over to the left of the cylinder, and we're going to knit back across these 8 stitches and then start re-engaging the needles as we go back around. So what I'm going to do is, first of all, just crank forward across those 8, and rehang my weights just to give some added tension. If you find that your stitches slip, like this one has just here, you can just lift that back over. It's not a problem, it happens all the time. I do it constantly. And then just fidget with your stitches so that they're sitting nicely against the cylinder. So for the first stitch in your increasing, you need to push down these first two needles on the right of your 8 that you started working up from, and then take your working yarn from the front and lift it over the back of those 2 stitches. So you can see we're moving the yarn from the front and lifting it over the back, and then all you need to do is crank back over those stitches. So you're engaging these 2 again, so now you're going to knit across 10 stitches. When you crank this first bit, it might feel like the yarn carrier is sticking a bit. Just add pressure gently but firmly, and you should be able to knit across them without a problem. Okay, so now we have 10 needles that are engaged. So we're going to do exactly the same on the left side. We're going to push those 2 needles down. We're going to lift the yarn from the front to the back. And I don't know whether you'll be able to tell, but the latches are actually closed on these 2 stitches. So we're going to open them to make sure that they get engaged properly. And then we're going to crank back across our now 12 live stitches. And again, do it nice and slowly. Might feel a bit stiff. Okay, so we've now got 12 active stitches. So from this point on, we're going to push down just 1 needle either side, not 2. So we'll push down the next needle. And again, we're going to lift the yarn from the front to the back. Ensure our latch hook is open. And then we're going to crank back across these stitches. Now the other thing you might notice is that my yarn's starting to creep up those needles again, and as soon as the yarn starts to creep up, that's an indicator that you need to rehang your heel weights to add more tension. So I'm going to move all of my heel weights up and towards and in towards the working needles. And you can see just by rehanging those that my yarn's now sitting nice and flush against my cylinder. So I'm going to crank back across these stitches. And again, we're mirroring on this side what we did on the first side, and we're going to push down that first needle. Take the yarn from the front to the back and ensure our latch hook is open. Now you can see the yarn's creeping up again already. If you don't want to keep adjusting your heel weights constantly every row, sometimes what I do is actually just hold the weight slightly and pull down very, very gently just to apply a slight bit of pressure, and then crank back across, ensuring that latch hook stays open. So we're going back across those needles, and we're just going to carry on doing exactly the same thing. So needle down, yarn from back to front, latch hook open, and back again. Needle down, yarn back to front, latch hook open, and just carry on. Okay, so what you want to keep doing is repeating this process until you get to 1 stitch before your halfway markers on either side of your cylinder. Okay, so I'm just going to adjust my heel weights again because my yarn's starting to ride up. When I first started knitting heels on the machine, I got really frustrated about how often I needed to move my needles, my weights, sorry, and it really annoyed me because it took me so much longer to actually do the sock. But that is so important that you make sure that your tension's right and that your weights are hung properly. It will make your process so much easier, much more straightforward. Okay, so at this point, we're actually 1 stitch from our halfway point. If I can just show you that.